Tonight, former Nebraska Congressman Jeff Fortenberry asked a federal appeals court for a new trial.
The 9-term congressman resigned last year after his conviction for making false statements regarding a federal investigation into illegal campaign contributions.
Our Brian Master reports his team believes California should have been the last place to try the case.
A man's life lies in ruins as a result of the government's decision to prosecute this case and to prosecute it in the Central District of California. And we would submit at a minimum that the congressman is entitled to a new trial.
Former Nebraska Congressman Jeff Fortenberry could have got jail time, but instead received probation as punishment when a jury found him guilty last year. The jury believed he made false statements twice to investigators when it came to their probe into a Nigerian businessman giving improper donations to lawmakers.
Let me ask you this. Where do you think the case should have been tried?
So I think the case could have been tried either in Nebraska or in the District of Columbia.
No, but there are two separate false statements. He made false statements in District of Columbia and Nebraska. So are you asking for two trials? I mean, how are you going to work that out?
So I think that there are a couple of things that the government could do in order to bring these counts within a single trial.
The federal judge last year ruled that the Central District of California worked as a venue for the case, since that's where the fundraiser took place, and his false statements were about that. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in California is being asked whether that's constitutional.
The reason that investigation was in the Central District of California was that the defendant chose to have a fundraiser here in Los Angeles. The defendant reached out to Dr. Ayub a second time asking for another fundraiser in Los Angeles. He chose that location. That is what prompted the FBI to get involved with the phone call between Ayub and the defendant. And the defendant, so he sort of chose the timing of that as well. And the second meeting in Washington, D.C., the defendant chose that location too.
Now, based on the questions, John, the judges seemed to wonder why the case was held in California. The hearing lasted 37 minutes. It's not clear when the Ninth Circuit will decide whether Jeff Fortenberry's guilty verdict is vacated or if he gets a new trial. Live in the newsroom, Brian Mastery, 6 News.